Hi, and thanks for watching this message video, and don't forget to go through the life lesson that goes with it. And for those who can't make a Sunday, don't forget that there is a podcast of that message that goes along with this message video and life lesson. Today we're continuing on in our series called Do You Know God, where we're looking at all of these different names for God and then connecting them to Jesus. The name that we're covering today is Jehovah-Rapha, which means the Lord is your healer, or the Lord who heals us. And this name is very interesting because it's a name that God gave for himself. It's not a name that an individual gave to God or made of God because of something that he did for them. This was a name that God created for himself. Now, in the overall timeline, when he created this name or gave this name for himself was shortly after the children of Israel left the land of Egypt. And there were a variety of different things that they had already experienced. But when God presents this name, he's presenting it with terms and conditions about how Jehovah-Rapha, the Lord, their healer, would go about healing them in their lives. For instance, here's what we're told. Exodus 15, 22 through 26. Then Moses led the people of Israel away from the Red Sea, and they moved out into the desert of Shur. They traveled in this desert for 3 days without finding any water. When they came to the oasis of Marah, the water was too bitter to drink. So they called the place Marah, which means bitter. Then the people complained and turned against Moses. "What are we going to drink?" they demanded. So Moses cried out to the Lord for help, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the water, and this made the water good to drink. It was there at Marah that the Lord set before them the following decree as a standard to test their faithfulness to him. He said, "If you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, obeying his commands and keeping all his decrees, then I will not make you suffer any of the diseases I sent on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." When God rescued the Israelites from the Egyptian armies at the Red Sea, he obviously proved that he had power over things like wind and waves. But now he was referencing something that he had already proven his power over, things like sickness and disease. For instance, in the plagues over the Egyptians, when the Israelites saw all that, he gave them things like boils or scurvy or an itch that there was no cure from. And these different diseases were the things that he was now saying that I'm not going to give them to you like I gave to them if you obey my decrees and follow my commands. This is a test for you. I will be Jehovah-Rapha in your life. Remember, I can turn water into blood, and now I just made water safe. So he's trying to prove to them, I can be this guy. So again, God warned the Israelites of the terms and conditions when it came to being Jehovah-Rapha. And the basic terms of this covenant were, if you obey me, you're going to be healthy, maybe even wealthy. And if you don't obey me, then you're going to suffer diseases. But in actuality, it was a lot more than just things like scurvy and an itch that there was no cure from. For instance, here's what we're also told. Exodus 23, 25 through 26. You must serve only the Lord your God. If you do, I will bless you with food and water, and I will protect you from illness. There will be no miscarriages or infertility in your land, and I will give you long, full lives. So as you can see, God is making it very clear. There are terms and conditions with him being Jehovah-Rapha, the God who heals you in their lives, and it applies to a whole lot more than just diseases, those kind of diseases that were on those Egyptians. So, based on the terms God presented, if anyone wasn't being blessed, it was easy to interpret their suffering as a result of their sin. But this interpretation that sin was the cause of suffering in someone's life was an idea or a perception that the Israelites actually already possessed long before God, Jehovah-Rapha, started to make these terms and conditions. For instance, for those of you who are maybe familiar with the story of Job, which Job existed long before any of the Israelites came into existence, this is what Job said when it came to sin. Job 16:8. As if to prove I have sinned, you've reduced me to skin and bones. My gaunt flesh testifies against me. For those who don't know the story of Job, he was the epitome of obedience to God. He was the example that God actually used of a person who was righteous, who wasn't sinful, but yet he was asked to suffer for a very specific purpose. And so when it came to this concept of sin being the only reason why a person suffered, well, they understood that that wasn't always true. But at the same time, the Israelites already at this point in time knew and understood that sin resulted in suffering for the most part. But they also knew, or at least they were going to learn, that when it came to sin and suffering, that suffering could be removed when you chose to no longer sin. This is a concept when it came to sin and suffering that the Israelites had a well-developed understanding of, particularly because of King David. For instance, this is what he said when it came to getting rid of sin and i.e. getting rid of suffering. Psalm 32, 1 through 5. Oh, what joy for those whose disobedience is forgiven, whose sin is put out of sight. Yes, what joy for those whose record the Lord is cleared of guilt, whose lives are lived in complete honesty. When I refused to confess my sin, my body wasted away, and I groaned all day long. Day and night, your hand of discipline was heavy on me. My strength evaporated like water in the summer heat. Finally, I confessed all my sins to you and stopped trying to hide my guilt. I said to myself, I will confess my rebellion to the Lord, and you forgave me. All my guilt is gone. David understood that the first step of repentance is confession to God, and that God was the one, even though there might be other people that he needed to apologize to, that God was the number one person that David needed to apologize to. And so confession was the first step. But then after that, there obviously was some correction that needed to happen in David's life after confession. And the same is true of us, meaning after we confess our sin to God, it's time to make corrections in our lives with how we live. Otherwise, the joy we experience at forgiveness will fade, just like what David mentions. For instance, look what Job also says about correction from God. Job 5, 17 through 18. But consider the joy of those corrected by God. Do not despise the discipline of the Almighty when you sin, for though he wounds, he also bandages. He strikes, but his hands also heal. So before the Israelites were ever given from Jehovah-Rapha these terms and conditions that if you are obedient and if you are righteous, then you have blessings in your life, or if you are sinful and you are rebellious, then you get these types of sufferings in your life. They already had this concept. They already knew the story of Job. They already understood that sort of a concept of prosperity associated with righteousness was the plan of God, or that punishment associated with sin was the plan of God. And this created inside of them a very judgy, a very judgmental mindset, where a lot of them apparently forgot that God had specifically chosen Job to suffer for a very specific reason, and it had nothing to do with sin. Now, this judgmental mindset continued on, and it continued on, and the evidence of that is when Jesus' disciples were walking with him one day, and they saw a blind man and automatically assumed that the reason why this man was blind or was suffering was because of sin. Here's exactly what Jesus said to them to correct this bad way of thinking. John 9, 1 through 3. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. Now notice that Jesus didn't deny to his disciples that blindness could have been the result of sin. But in this instance, he made it very clear that no, this guy's blindness wasn't the result of sin. This was an instance of where Jehovah-Rapha, the Lord who heals you, was wanting to heal this man in a very powerful way to prove a point. So therefore, asking him to suffer for all of those years was also for a point. You see, what Jesus was trying to help these disciples understand, and ultimately what God was trying to help all of the Israelites to understand, is that the thing that Jehovah-Rapha wants to heal isn't necessarily a body or a skin disease or some sort of blindness. It's a soul. It's the most important thing. In fact, after Jesus healed a man who was lame, look at what it is that he said to him about his soul. John 5:14. Now you are well, so stop sinning, or something even worse may happen to you. The something worse that Jesus was obviously talking about was this man's soul. His body had just been healed. He was now capable of walking, and he was praising God for that. But Jesus was letting him know, all I did was just heal something that was temporary. The thing that's eternal, your soul, it also needs to heal. And so unless you stop sinning, there's a problem that still exists for you. This was the same thing that he kept trying to convey to his disciples so that they would understand too. The most important thing that you guys need to help people understand that God, Yahweh, Jehovah-Rapha is here to do is to help people heal their souls. In fact, look at what Jesus said to his disciples about souls. Matthew 16:24-26. Then Jesus said to his disciples, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Take up your cross and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? Jesus, who is Jehovah-Rapha, the Lord who heals you, definitely healed that lame man. However, that lame man's soul would never, ever, ever be healed unless he, in faith, believed in Christ and then received his spirit into his soul to help heal it. So in essence, regardless of how healthy or wealthy someone appears, if their soul is unhealthy, the work of Jehovah-Rapha is incomplete in their lives. So to wrap up, here's some questions and answers that we've learned today. Number one, can physical disease or suffering be the result of sin? Yes. So if you, like David, need to confess your sin and then experience some correction in your life, then get to it. Number two, is the cause of suffering always due to sin? No. Suffering is not always about sin. Sometimes suffering is about God wanting to, Jehovah-Rapha, wanting to prove his power to heal us. And so therefore, that suffering is simply there to make a point, which therefore you and I shouldn't do, or like what Job had to, or what the blind man had to. Number three, is physical health and wealth a sign of God's blessing? Yes. However, like in the story that Luke recorded where Jesus was talking about the wealthy farmer, sometimes a person's wealth or their overall prosperity is not a reflection of the condition of their soul. Jesus criticized this man, even though he had incredible wealth and seemed to be blessed and appeared obviously righteous. He criticized this man because he didn't have a rich relationship with God. And so, sometimes that wealth or sometimes that prosperity that seemingly looks like a blessing from God isn't a blessing from God. All that is something that's actually tripping a person up. And so, the number one thing that we've really learned is this. Jehovah-Rapha, the Lord who heals us, certainly can heal us of any kind of disease. He certainly can heal us from any kind of sickness. And he wants to. But there are times when clearly God allows for suffering in our lives because he's trying to make a very important point. And maybe the most important point that Jehovah-Rapha wants to make is that our soul is the number one thing that needs healing. And as long as we are willing to invite him into our lives, he promises he will heal our soul.